Hi there, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. And what a fabulous guest we have today. He is an authority when it comes to China and how China has conducted some of their human rights policies. And I'm delighted, Dr. Adrian Zenz. And you're going to want to keep up with him. And you're going to find him on social media. I want to give you this at the top of the show, and I'll do it again at the end. It is at Adrian, ADRIANZENZ, and the Victims of Communism Foundation at VO Communism. So make a note on that, and you will appreciate what he has to say about the CCP's human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And he is a senior fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He is the author of Tibetanness Under Threat and co-editor of Mapping Ando Dynamics of Change. His research focus is on China's ethnic policy, public recruitment in Tibet and Xinjiang, Beijing's internment campaign, and China's domestic security budgets. As I said, an area of expertise that is so needed and information that is so needed as we look at China and these abuses. So, Dr. Zenz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you indeed, Senator.
Yes, I want to talk with you a little bit. The Uyghurs are undergoing absolute extreme forms of human right abuse, and we are hearing about forced labor, forced sterilization, forced abortions. The list goes on, and your reports really do cover a wide range of issues, including providing documentation of the existence of these re-education camps. And despite these flagrant violations of human rights, China was recently elected to the UN Human Rights Council, which is just astounding to me that this could have occurred. So what do you make of that, and what has your research shown with respect to the effects of growing Chinese influence in international organizations?
Growing Chinese influence in multilateral institutions such as United Nations, World Health Organization, etc., is part of a deliberate strategy of China to increase its influence abroad and to make the world safer for its brand of authoritarianism. China is using a strategy that's sometimes referred to as elite capture, which refers to a very targeted influencing of existing elites, as well as trying to promote people into leadership positions in these organizations that are either Chinese government appointed, or are heavily influenced and will basically more or less dance to Beijing's tune. Beijing's strategy of increasing economic and political influence in the developing world, Africa, Asia, etc., including through the Belt and Road Initiative, has greatly increased its leverage influence over other countries. So, for example, if you see a number of Western democracies writing a letter to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, pointing out the terrible atrocities in Xinjiang, for example, against the Uyghurs, or in Tibet, China ends up mobilizing nearly twice as many signatories, countries, to a counter letter, subscribing and underwriting its own propaganda. And all this is part of the international elite capture strategy.
Okay, and you have talked some about being a victim of communism as a state or a form of government, and they use that in some of these human rights abuses. I'll talk for just a minute about that, victims of communism, and the effect that has on the Chinese people, especially the Uyghurs?
With the advent of communism under Mao Zedong, the Chinese people experienced very soon a very draconian form of authoritarianism that proved to repress their lives in many ways. The communist regime sought to reshape people, reshape society. It was about eradicating tradition in a very rapid way, which you saw with the Great Leap Forward, with the 100 Flowers movement, with the Cultural Revolution in particular. It was a very brutal, but also very disorganized attempt to suppress traditional values and cultures, religions of any kind, be they Western, be they indigenous. And the minorities were severely affected. You had the closure of Buddhist monasteries, the closures of mosques, severe persecution of religious figureheads. What we're seeing now is in some ways a very sophisticated, high-tech and highly organized and well-funded revival of some of the core goals of the Cultural Revolution under President Xi Jinping. You have a new form of high-tech authoritarianism that is surveying people, keeping very close tabs on what people say. For example, you have some whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang was trying to alert his own people, his own circles about the coronavirus early on, and with the digital surveillance mechanisms, the police found out about it and was suppressing it, and he got reprimanded. There's more severe examples then later on, people, so-called citizen journalists, since there's no free press, just trying to report from Wuhan and other places about the situation. They have been disappeared. One of them has recently been charged and is going to be in prison for several years. The ethnic minorities suffer doubly in some way because their loyalty to the country is doubted, especially with the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. So they are expected to become loyal Chinese citizens, which is a severe clash in many ways with their own ethnic identity, at least the way, in the assimilatory way that Beijing is demanding it from them. At the same time, they are adherents of their own religious identities, which is coming under ever closer repression as well, along with the repression of religion in the entire country, looking at Protestants, Catholics, any kind of Muslims, even indigenous religions such as Taoism and Chinese Buddhism are increasingly repressed.
Let me ask you this, because sometimes we wonder if there's anything we can do that is going to make a difference. And recently I joined Senators Cornyn and Menendez in a resolution that was passed here in the Senate. And what it did was to recognize China's actions against the Uyghurs as genocide, because that is what it is. And I feel like the U.S. administration, the UN, that these national organizations should be listening and paying attention to this. So talk to me about the weight it carries or the message it sends when we do something in Congress, and when you can get the UN to step in and do something such as recognizing these actions as a genocide.
As we talked about before, the United Nations has been very ineffective, almost paralyzed when it comes to Chinese human rights atrocities. This was very visible in 2018 when there was the review of China's human rights situation, especially with the ethnic discrimination hearings. And China's human rights track record, and we're talking end of 2018, when the internment camps, over 1 million Uyghurs are in camps by then, and China's record was approved. They passed the review positively because they had enough countries on their side. And now, as you have pointed out, they themselves sit on the Human Rights Council. And in this unfortunate and shocking situation, the leadership of the American government on the one hand, but also, as you say, the Congress and the Senate, is all the more significant. The world pays close attention, for example, to the fact that finally, after some time, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act was approved, a very significant first piece of legislation demanding closer scrutiny. This was a first in the world. No other government in the world has done this. And the United States administration has taken important steps. But unfortunately, the State Department has so far not put forward a legal designation of the atrocities in Xinjiang or in Tibet. The State Department has the authority and the power to determine that what is taking place formally corresponds to a legal definition of either atrocity, crimes against humanity, or even of genocide. And that would be very significant. Them not doing so, as you yourself said, legislation could have a similar effect at almost forcing or causing the US government to make such a designation and to look into this designation. And therefore, I think these steps are very significant.
Okay, and then let me ask you this. I know you've written a lot and have reported on the CCP's push against the Uyghurs, things to suppress birth rates, things of that nature. What do you think, when you look at the treatment of the Uyghurs, what do you think is the CCP's ultimate goal?
The CCP's ultimate goal in regards to its ethnic minorities is to have them firmly integrated into, well, we might almost call it the Chinese Empire, because some of the worldview behind this really harks back to the empires, the Qing Empire, the other empires. Okay. There's a real historic root here. So firm integration means they are loyal to the Chinese state. They identify as Chinese, even though at least superficially they're permitted to keep a distinct identity, but this distinct ethnic or religious identity must be superficial. So they can do some colorful dancing, they can speak a couple of words of their language, they can sell their ethnic food or snacks, but anything beyond that very quickly becomes suspicious, even problematic, and is actively repressed.
Let me ask you this. I know China always thinks about the dollar and being a part of the global community. Even though they don't want to be a part of it, they want to dominate it. So as we look at the 22 Winter Olympics, do you think that there will be countries that will boycott because of China's human rights abuses?
I certainly hope there will be countries. Whether there will be or not, I think depends on the resolve of countries and what they understand the Olympics to be, what their value of human rights is, whether they think that Beijing hosting them is appropriate or not. That's unfortunately an open question. But I think that the question of the Olympics in 2022 is one of the big pressure points that human rights advocacy has against Beijing, along also with forced labor, and pointing out forced labor and making sure that Beijing's business of oppression, exploiting the minorities, comes to an end.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Again, Dr. Adrian Zenz, Senior Fellow at the Victims of Communism Foundation, and the amazing work that he is doing. As I said at the beginning, you can follow him online at Adrian Zenz and at VO Communism. You can always find me online at Marsha Blackburn and sign up for our Blackburn report at our website, blackburn.senate.gov. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I apologize for having to go vote and for my tardiness.
That's your job. That's no problem. You must be busy having both a social media and blogs and video and everything else.
And having to do my job. You're right.
On the side, yeah. I sometimes feel like that too. I sometimes do a little research on the side between interviews.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you indeed.
Yes.